So welcome everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for this exciting presentation on the relevance of social psychology for science communication. Very important interdisciplinary point of view that we're going to hear tonight from Emma. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand over to Emma.
Okay, so hi, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Emma, and today I'm going to talk a bit about the relevance of psychology for science communication and how we can use social psychology to have maximum impact when conveying a message. So I just wanted to start off by introducing myself and who I am and what I do here at Plover Rovers. So as I said, I'm Emma. I've recently graduated in psychology, and I'm really passionate about conservation and ocean literacy. My role here at Plover Rovers is to help bridge the gap between the environmental community and social psychology to help Plover Rovers messaging have maximum impact. So to start off, what is social psychology? Social psychology is the study of human interaction. It seeks to understand how people affect and are affected by other people, how people's thoughts, feelings, behaviours are affected by the real, imagined or implied presence of other people. So this is how it's been defined by the Oxford Dictionary. And I don't know about you, but I have no idea what that means. So in simple, social psychology essentially aims to understand people's behaviours, perceptions, thoughts and feelings, so essentially human underpinnings. By understanding human underpinnings, this then enables us to change people's thoughts, feelings, motivation, and in turn, often this helps reach their ultimate goal of altering people's behaviour. So on to the big question about why everybody's here. Why is social psychology relevant to science communication? Social psychology is useful for communication in general, as in order to effectively communicate with people, you need to understand, again, their underpinnings, so their thoughts, feelings, motivations, behaviours, and so on. Communication needs to be clear for the audience to understand the message and change their behaviour accordingly. However, scientific concepts are often really complex, so it can be difficult for the lay audience to understand. As science communication is often complex, social psychological techniques can help communicate the message in a way that the audience can then understand. Applying social psychology to science communication messaging can help the wider audience with attention. Social psychology allows us to write a message in a way that grabs people's attention and makes them want to learn more. For example, about science communication that perhaps people might not be interested in otherwise. It can also help with comprehension. It allows us to then write the message in a way that the audience can comprehend and find interesting. Often, when writing a message, we write it in a way that we understand, and it is very difficult to look upon it throughout someone else's eyes or hasn't got prior knowledge in the topic. It may not make sense to somebody else as it does yourself. And social psychology can help overcome this barrier and write the message in a way that the audience can then understand. Social psychology's understanding of people and what makes them tick allows us to then influence their attitudes and in turn help them change their behaviour accordingly. This is relevant for science communication and especially conservation and ocean empowerment, because at the end of the day, that's why we're all here, to help people's behaviours become greener and more sustainable. The environmental community have recognised that messaging is key to changing maladaptive behaviours. In fact, a recent meta-analysis conducted by social psychologists have found that interest in conservation messaging amongst the environmental community is rapidly growing. However, many published studies in this field do not draw on established behaviour change theories or audience segmentation techniques. This presents a barrier for presenting scientific information to the wider community. Social psychological knowledge of behaviour change can help overcome this barrier by making messaging more effective and encouraging people to change their behaviour accordingly. Also, over the last few years, environmental sustainability is becoming increasingly important to social psychologists, partly due to the negative impact environmental degradation has on mental and social well-being, but mainly due to the impact it has on our planet. However, social psychologists don't have the same knowledge of the environment as the environmental community do. So what we need to do is bridge the gap between these two fields to help the community engage in much more sustainable behaviours. So before I go into a bit more about how we apply social psychology to science communication, I just want to put out a quick disclaimer. I am in no way, shape or form as experienced in conservation and the environment as I'm sure many of the people watching this webinar are. So what I'm aiming to do in this webinar is just present strong psychological theories of behaviour change and impactful messaging techniques that hopefully you can take away and apply to any messaging in the future. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the cycle that you can see on the screen about perhaps why people aren't absorbing the messaging. And I'm just going to start off by talking a bit about uncertainty reduction theory. Uncertainty reduction theory is essentially people tend to be interested in concepts that they're already knowledgeable about and tend to be very adverse to things that they're not already very knowledgeable about or they're unfamiliar with. You know, they might be very unfamiliar for lots of reasons. For example, it's not discussed within their community, within their friends, family. Anyway, lots of reasons perhaps why people aren't familiar with it. And this takes us on to mental shortcuts, also known as heuristics. Now, everybody uses mental shortcuts on a daily basis as it helps reduce cognitive load, as we just don't have the mental resources to pay attention to everything that we come across. This results in us making quick, uninformed decisions that decide what we do and do not pay attention to. And we do tend to pay attention to things that we are already familiar with, and we tend to filter out things that we are unfamiliar with. A combination of being adverse to novel concepts and our mental shortcuts filtering out these novel concepts causes us to then ignore the message. And because we ignore the message, we then do not have the opportunity to then become familiar with the concept. So it's just a deadly cycle. And what we need to do is try and break this cycle to help people then pay attention. Now, a great way to break this cycle is the repeated exposure effect. The repeated exposure effect is something that we see on a daily basis. I'm sure you recognise many of these advertisements from the bottom of the screen that use this technique very successfully. So the repeated exposure effect is essentially showing the audience the same content or message on repeat, because the more we see something, the more we like it, and then the more we think about it. Many studies have shown that, although at first we may get a bit irritated by seeing the same message on repeat, however, this irritation does wear off and the audience will then have a much more favourable opinion towards the brand or the message. This favourable opinion will then help reduce the uncertainty around the message or the concept and make people more familiar with it, and then they're more likely to think about it. Also, another important note on this is the more familiar we get with it and the more we think about it, the more likely we are to then talk and spread the message. And that's what we want to do here. We want people to talk about what Plover Rovers are doing and spread the positive message. So a little anecdote I like to tell for the repeated exposure effect is when I was about 7 years old, I had a fascination with the Vanish Oxy Action washing powder, just because I'd seen the advert on TV all the time and trust pink to get stains. And I had a fascination with it, but as a 7-year-old, I had no interest in washing. In fact, as a 23-year-old, I still have no interest in washing, but I would still beg my mum to get the washing powder every time we went to the shop because I saw the message very regularly and used to think about it, and I trusted the brand. Also, another little take-home message from this is that not only was I thinking about this product and beginning to form a favourable opinion towards it, I was also sharing my favourable opinion and sharing the message. That's what we want to do here at Plover Rovers. We want people to start thinking about the message and then passing on and sharing the message. Another great way to break the cycle is by the leveraging position bias. The leveraging position bias is a great way to draw people's attention to a message. Many eye tracking studies have shown that people are much more likely to pay attention and act on a message when the key message is at the top of the page in big, bold letters. Also, a very strong technique is having advertisements on the right-hand side of the page, as that's just where our eye tends to draw towards. So if it's on the right-hand side of the page, people are much more likely to act on and pay attention and form a favourable opinion towards the message. Now, I heard of this technique while I was at university, and to be honest, I didn't really think that much of it until I started working in the industry where I am at the moment. And I realised that companies do often pay thousands or tens of thousands of pounds more purely to have that advertisement on the right-hand side of the page. And it really does make a difference to brand awareness. Another strong technique is using colour. The human brain tends to link colours to certain feelings, emotions, and concepts. For example, the colour green, people instantly relate to the environment. Or the colour red, people realise that it's urgent, or the colour blue makes them feel calm. So try and correlate the colours to what you're discussing. So if you're talking about something urgent in the environment, use the colours green and red where possible. Or if you're talking about a calming sea, use the colours blue and green. Now, the next model I'm going to talk about is an excellent, well-known model that is often used for persuasion and messaging. It's called the Elaboration Likelihood Model, also known as the ELM. Now, the ELM states that there are two main routes in the brain, the central route and the peripheral route. The central route is very conscious and very logical, and people tend to take this route when they already have an interest in a topic. And also taking this route tends to lead to a very consolidated permanent behaviour change. But I'm not going to go too much into this today, as this is the route that somebody like you or I, who already has an interest in the environment, would take. I'm going to focus on the peripheral route, which is perhaps a lay novel person that perhaps hasn't had interest before would be more likely to take. So the peripheral route is much more emotional. And it's very unconscious, and it does lead to a behaviour change. However, it's less permanent, but it's still a very good way for a person to get to know and become familiar with a concept.
So what we'd be looking to do is to make people take the peripheral route just so that they become somewhat acquainted with the concept and sort of give them enough knowledge to break that vicious circle you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And then they be able to accumulate more and more knowledge so that then they will be able to take the central route eventually.
Exactly, and then have the permanent behaviour change.
Okay.
If you were to show people the central route technique straight away, they're just going to filter out and not pay attention to it.
Right. Okay. And the other one just comes in more through more sort of gut feeling, on a gut feeling level, you could say.
And as I said, it's very unconscious, so people perhaps won't even realise that they're absorbing the message.
Right.
To route techniques, you have to actively seek to take the route and look into it further, if that makes sense. Cool. So as I said, human emotion is processed via the peripheral route in the brain, and it is an extremely effective way to gain attention to a message. Now, playing on emotion is commonly used within the environmental community to gain attention, and it is widely used within messaging. For example, you can see the UNICEF campaigns on the screen now. However, you might be surprised to hear that Yeah, this does discuss emotion. However, it's actually quite counterproductive, this type of messaging. Now, talking about kind of 600,000 children or 1.4 million children, it is scary. However, it's not something that people can picture or relate to. If people can't relate to something, they are then less likely to pay attention to it. Also, people evaluate harm very differently from before and after an event has occurred. If something has already occurred, for example, happens yearly, it's happened yearly previously, people are more likely to think, well, it's happened, I can't do anything to change this. However, if you talk about something that will happen, if you don't change your actions, X, Y, Z will happen, people are more likely to change their behaviours to avoid the outcome. So if big numbers and shocking statistics don't work, how do we get our message across? Overall, people will pay much more attention if they can picture and relate to the person in the advertisement or the concept that you're discussing. So what we need to do is make it vivid and something that the reader can envision. To do this, I always like to talk about a technique called name, face, place. This is a great way to help the reader picture and imagine something that may happen. Also, wherever we can, we need to make the message positive and solution orientated. In fact, a recent study has shown that positive messaging framing, rather than negative, more scientific framing, significantly increases climate-related engagement and activation amongst community members. Also, wherever possible, we need to use personal pronouns such as you, as this is an extremely effective way for the audience to then consider their own actions. An example of a company that successfully uses emotion to gain attraction to their message is the John Lewis Christmas adverts, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Every year, these advertisements have me in tears, but they also have me shopping on their website. Their advertisements follow the main principles above. So they have a positive storyline that uses identifiable individuals that people can relate to, and it follows them in real time in preparation for their future Christmas. So for my final method of communication, I'm going to touch on social norms. However, I'm not going to go too in depth in this webinar, otherwise we'll be here all night. So it is in human nature to like to be liked. This goes back to our basic biological need of needing to be part of a group, as being ostracised could be absolutely detrimental to ourselves. This manifests in today's society as a theory called social identity theory. Social identity theory is basically a sense of self based on your group membership. And this divides into two separate theories called the in-group and out-group. People strive to be part of a group and they look favourably upon their own group and very negatively upon other groups. Also, people tend to want to be part of the strongest and most successful group. So what we want to do at Plover Rovers is to become that strong, successful group. Also, you need to make people feel like they're the odd one out for not adhering to conservation. A good example of making people feel like the odd one out and not adhering to conservation is it's a really well-known study which some of you may have heard of previously called the hotel guest study. So in this study, guests at a certain hotel, half of them were presented with scientific information regarding environmental impacts of using a towel once, and the other half of the guests were shown information saying that, the rest of our guests reuse their towels. People that were shown the advertisement saying that, the rest of our guests reuse their towels were significantly more likely to reuse their towels than the people being shown the environmental benefits. This is due to normative social influence. So essentially, we just need to make people feel like they're being perhaps ostracized if they don't adhere to the conservation norms. However, there is a slight problem with creating this group effect, and it's called the bystander effect. So the bystander effect occurs when the presence of others discourages an individual from intervening in a situation. As a rule of thumb, the greater number of bystanders or members of a group, the less likely one is to then provide help. This is because people diffuse responsibility. People diffuse responsibility for all sorts of reasons. For example, they feel like it's not their problem because other people are there. However, quite often it is to do with kind of self-confidence, thinking, oh, there's a greater number of people here. What if I intervene and I do this wrong? So how do we create the in-group and out-group without the bystander effect? What we need to try and do is create a community feel. We need to show people that they do actually have an influence on the rest of the group. For example, where possible, respond positively to any interaction, reply to tweets, like tweets. We just need to make individuals show that they are wanted and that they are valued and they can make a difference. Also, wherever possible, try to use personal pronouns. We need to reinforce that although they are part of a group, their individual actions do make a difference. Also, making examples of people helping is a very strong way to prevent the bystander effect. Studies have shown that people are more likely to be pro-social and helpful if they see other people helping. Here, it's very beneficial to use the name, face, place technique, as the audience can envision and relate the other people that are helping. We already do this at Plover Rovers, which I'm very happy to say, where we have the page of volunteers. And again, that's where we use the name, face, place technique. And finally, motivation. So there are two main types of motivation, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and they're called intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is very tangible. It uses money, merchandise, and there's intrinsic motivation, which essentially comes from praise and learning. Intrinsic motivation is also known to significantly increase people's confidence, and people are more likely to take ownership of a problem. Therefore, this helps reduce the bystander effect, as people will feel like they can take ownership of the problem and they can fix an issue without having to wait for others. So as we are a charity, extrinsic motivations might not be suitable for our cause. So focusing on intrinsic motivation is much more beneficial. And there are a few ways to put in place intrinsic motivation. And the best way to do this is by helping people to learn, because the more people learn, the more motivated and confident they feel in their abilities. So fundamentally, we're already doing this by producing articles. However, I guess we could take it a step further. A good way to do this is quizzes. Quizzes help consolidate what people have just learned. So perhaps at the end of articles, we could add a little quiz on what the person has just read. After taking the quiz, if the people have done well, they'll feel really motivated as they've just learned something new. If a person doesn't do as well, they could see this as a challenge to go seek and learn more information. And as their scores start to increase, so will their confidence, and hopefully the bystander effect will reduce. And that's all from tonight. I've just put a few take-home messages on the screen. So if you're going to take anything away, just remember the importance of message repetition, because the more we see something, the more we like it. Remember the importance of a page layout, because it really can help draw attention to certain areas of a message. Personalization, name, face, place. And definitely, for me, the most important take-home message is positive messaging, because the more positive a message is, the more attention we'll pay. And yeah, that's it from me. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was great. Yeah, everyone feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions for Emma.
I was curious, it's not really an environmental one, but when you were saying about people preferring things on the right hand side, I don't know, it's really interesting because obviously people read from left to right. So I guess I would have presumed that it'd have been left. Do you know why that is? They have that preference?
No, there's many theories behind it, but there's no definite answer to it, which yeah, it's really interesting. There's so many studies in it, eye tracking studies, but why it is, nobody really knows.
You think that's maybe because most people are right-handed, like it's a sexist thing? Or?
So it's interesting. Scott and I have spoken about this before, and yeah, no, it's actually something that I'm going to have another look into at some point, but that could be a good theory. It'd be an interesting study if you were to carry out eye tracking studies of a left-handed person to see if it's the same effect.
One thing that I found interesting, and because it's something that I've noticed in the messaging around climate change and climate change effects, is that you said people are, once something has happened, it's kind of like, okay, it has happened, I can't change it anymore. If it's still going to happen, people are going to be more willing to do something to maybe take a different path or make it not happen. Do you know if there are any studies how the wording actually influences it? Because there's two ways that you see these possible effects of climate change worded, and you have the sort of more scientifically correct way, maybe, where they're saying this and this and this and this could happen if we have a 2-degree warming. And then there's a way of doing it a little bit more sort of sensationalist, maybe, and saying this and this and this will happen.
Will happen. Yeah, definitely will happen. You know, so it's much more, yeah, it's much better to say this will happen than, oh, this might happen, because again, if something might happen, people might say, well, it might also not happen. Yeah, no, that's another good point.
Because I think that sometimes as scientists, we probably struggle to do that, because we always say, well, statistically, yes, but of course you can never tell. And it, you know, it's, so for scientists it might seem like you're already really putting yourself out there by saying this could happen, or there's a very high probability that this will happen. But I think for messaging, sometimes it might actually be just more conducive to what we want to do, that we say this will happen. And we have from here in the chat, from Miri, saying, I think it's just important to not overuse this communicating very sharply, because it's something then does not happen in the end. People have the feeling you're lying or exaggerating. And she says, I feel this is happening a lot in corona communication and reception. And I think that is a very important point as well. Of course, you don't want people to be able to point their fingers at you and say, ha, but this didn't happen. And I think that brings me to this idea of ostracizing people who aren't behaving in the way that we want them to behave. And I was wondering, how can we avoid ostracizing people too early? So that because you do get this very strong anti, like, for example, as a vegan, I know that you sometimes have to be very careful about how you handle your in and your out group, if you potentially want to keep the path open for people to join the in group later on.
Yeah, no, definitely, that is an important point to make. Off the top of my head, I'm not too sure if that's a good question. It's something I should probably look into a little bit further.
Yeah, because I think that's just something that because we want to be, of course, we want to be positive and inclusive, but at the same time, I absolutely agree that it's a good thing if someone feels like they're the odd one out if they're not behaving in a certain way. So I think there's just a line that we need to toe there, and we need to kind of figure out what is still basically the maximum that we can reach without pushing people away too early, but at the same time making clear that this is the behavior that we're kind of expecting from people.
Yeah.
And there's another question. Hi, Emma. Do you know if there are any studies about the effect of different types of imagery? For example, clear, crisp, simplistic versus perhaps more realistic but more complex images?
Off the top of my head, I'm not too sure. That's not really something I've looked into previously in terms of kind of the more crisp images and so on. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not too sure on that.
I could imagine if you look at the world of advertising, I think you can see that there's definitely, there seems to be a trend to simplify very often, but I would agree that realistic images, on the other hand, could maybe trigger a more emotional response in people. I should probably know this as I am an illustrator, Susie says. Actually, I can say something to that, because I did some time ago, I did a workshop on scientific illustration, and we actually talked about that. I just remembering it now, that the illustrator who was running it talked about scientific drawings, and that question of how detailed should you be and how much should you simplify in order to get the message across. And I think that he said that you will probably need to simplify and structure your illustration in a way that people can easily understand it, but then again toe that fine line between still being scientific and not simplifying too much, which in science communication, of course, that's always the line we're trying to toe, between simplifying it enough but not too much. There's another question from Miri. She has a question on the positive communication. I'm just wondering, because some movements like Extinction Rebellion are very popular, but more relying on negative feelings. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Personally, I think I would completely avoid the negative side of it. As a whole, people don't like to be criticised, and the idea of if something very scary happened, they're more likely just to turn a blind eye on. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it's something positive, people then feel more positive, and then will help want to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's very much what our approach at Plover Rovers is. I wonder right now if it's maybe also a generational thing, because I think I probably would have absolutely loved Extinction Rebellion when I was 16, because it's kind of like this, you're up against things and you want to shock, you want to kind of shake society out of that lull. And then maybe once we're older, we crave more security, and we crave more, we want to be constructive and not destructive. So I wonder if it's a generational thing partly as well. The appeal of it. Okay, well, if anyone comes up with questions later on, you're welcome to contact Emma or myself, and I'll pass it on to her. Yeah, thank you very much again. That was really, really interesting. I will put this presentation up on YouTube as well within the next week or so. And also anyone who missed the exciting presentation on transdisciplinary work and systems thinking and that stuff, that's all on our YouTube channel now. So if you want to take a look at that, you're very welcome. The diversity webinar is also up on our YouTube channel. So we're filling that up by now. And yeah, thank you all for tuning in. And that's it from us. Have a great evening. And we're hoping to see you again soon. And we have here, thank you so much, Emma. That was really helpful and insightful, says Susie.